mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me today is John Pollmann, the Ducks Unlimited freelance writer out of South Dakota. John, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Happy to be with you today.
Awesome, man. I know you guys are getting beat up with some snow up there in South Dakota in your neck of the woods right now. But wanted to get you on the show here, just kind of do a little bit of a Central Flyway roundup, kind of what you're hearing. I know you're kind of the guy, the point man, who's talking to people on the ground throughout the Flyway and beyond. So just to kind of get it started, I know, your guys' duck season is over, is it not?
It is in the low plains. We have the duck season out along the Missouri River stays open until January here a little bit, but for the most part, there's not much for duck season left here in South Dakota. And in all honesty, there aren't many ducks left here either. It's been, we've had a real winter, and even just going back to the week before Thanksgiving, the week before Christmas, we had a really serious winter storm come through, blizzard conditions throughout much of the eastern half of South Dakota, and that really did a number on the birds that did remain here. And so it's just been kind of a one system after another, bringing cold temps, but then heavy snow and wind. And the combination of those things has really locked up habitat conditions here in South Dakota. Any birds that we have here right now, they aren't going anywhere because they've stuck it out through some of the worst conditions that I've seen in quite some time. So, yeah, it's been quite the winter season already, and it's only beginning in January. So, flip side of that, it's good news for habitat conditions, but in terms of hunting opportunities and bird numbers in the state, we're pretty well wrapped up.
That's awesome. I mean, that's awesome news for us to hear, but it's also awesome. I'm just sitting there thinking, like, how hardy do those mallards have to be? They're staying up there on the Missouri River, and they're going to tough it out up there. There's always a couple 100,000 that probably stick around up there. But man, those birds have got to be tough.
It blows my mind. Honestly, it does. The conditions that they will put themselves through to stay up here as far north as they can. We had real air temperatures of minus 15, minus 17, 18 degrees below zero around Christmas time. And then you added in the wind chill factor, and it was 40, 50 below zero. And on top of that, there's deep snow, but yet there are still birds hanging around. And there are. I mean, they've kind of moved into those wintering areas in the Missouri River, some metro areas, and around Sioux Falls, one of the bigger towns here in South Dakota. And so there are birds that are sticking it out. But the fact they've done that in the face of just terribly frigid conditions, deep snow, it just shows you how tough they are. I'm impressed. I really am every year.
Yeah, that is impressive. So as you kind of, bounce around the Flyway, I know you're probably constantly on the phone or hitting people up for information for different migration alerts throughout the season. But, where are you starting out as far as what are you hearing from Nebraska or, some of those areas just a little bit further south of you?
It's going back in Nebraska itself, they've been dealing with some really dry conditions this fall, really throughout the Central Flyway, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, just really, really dry, and Nebraska up until, the winter season here, still extremely dry, which impacted, bird concentrations, where they were going to be at. I know in Nebraska itself, Kansas as well, the conversations that I had there, farm ponds, some of the stock pond areas that tend to be pretty deep, provided a lot of the some of the hunting action, at least where birds were concentrated this year. In Nebraska itself, western Nebraska got hit pretty hard with some winter weather. I know they received a pretty good push of Canada geese around Christmas time. from here in South Dakota. I mean, we kind of emptied out at that point, I think, whether it was mallards, snow geese, honkers. And so their hunting, though, is still pretty tough. I mean, it seems like the line where these birds are at has kind of continued, in terms of the bulk of the bird numbers, has continually pushed south. And so, Nebraska right now, still pockets of some honkers, where the Platte River has some open water and water in it itself. There are some birds around, but again, it's in terms of a season where we're talking about clearing out the prairies in the northern part of the Central Flyway. This is one of those years where I think we've had everything we can to push these birds south. And like I mentioned earlier, there still are pockets of birds here and there that are willing to stick it out. But by and large, South Dakota, Nebraska, these birds have pushed through. They are out of the region, and hopefully in places where hunters can take advantage of them further south.
Yeah, and one area that always comes to mind, kind of right there on the Central and Mississippi Flyway, meet right there in the corner of Northwest Missouri. That's always an area, at least from my perspective, I look at as, when that area really freezes up and really, gets cold, a lot of ducks push out of there. And I think we had that week of Christmas. I think they lost a bunch of birds, but I think right after that, there was a pretty good warm up, and I'm sure they're piling back in around that area. What are you hearing from that area?
Exactly that. Around Christmas time, I know Los Bluffs, in that northwest corner of Missouri, they were completely frozen, at least that end of December. And things are starting to warm back up a little bit, and those birds they'll trickle back in. As soon as they get a little bit of a warm up, it seems like they'll push back north out of Arkansas. Again, they just want to be as close up here to the breeding grounds, I think, as possible. And so you're seeing a little bit of that now. I think by and large, though, still, it is one of those situations where they had enough weather at the right time to push those birds out of there. In Northwest Missouri, their duck season is close at this point, and so there's not a whole lot of hunting opportunities there. But it's I think again that line of where those birds are at has really pushed south this year, and hopefully again to the benefit of people down further down south, hunters with some opportunities here in January. It's been, like I say, it's been a real winter. Deep cold, snow cover, wind, all of those conditions that you need to push birds south.
Yeah, and I think there's most of the hunters around this region, around the Mid-South, have mentioned there was a pretty good little uptick in birds, and not necessarily mallards in some areas, but certainly gadwall and green-winged teal. Even at the place where I hunt, we have a bunch of green-winged teal just had pushed in that week of Christmas, and then we obviously froze up, and it was game over here for 3 or 4 days, at least in the fields. We haven't gotten much out of Oklahoma. And I know you'd mentioned hadn't gotten much, but overall, I think Kansas and Oklahoma were very similar as Nebraska, like you mentioned, where, they were really dry going into it. So there was a lot of habitat unavailable to hunt. But those who had some water seem to be doing pretty well. Just kind of word on the street and what I'm seeing from the DU migration map. It seems like guys going to Oklahoma are doing well. Are you kind of hearing the same thing?
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like the places where they've had water, have had enough water to stop birds on their way south, that they're doing pretty well. But again, like you say, it was one of those seasons where even just in terms of management on state areas in Oklahoma, where they didn't have the water conditions there to provide the food that normally attracts birds. Some places, the bigger reservoirs, they were doing drawdowns anyway, and so the water levels dropped even more in some places. I think it's been a tough season in that regard, but if you had the conditions, if you had the water, I think you've done fairly well. Just those birds tend to be concentrated. And if you're able to manage that hunting pressure on them a little bit, then I think you can do pretty well on things. That's one side of this that I think gets overlooked sometimes, is that, when we do water conditions are down, bird numbers do get concentrated, but they also will be, a little more susceptible to hunting pressure. And so the hunters that are able to do pretty well are those that know how to manage that pressure, where they're not pounding on those birds every single day. They'll try to bounce things around or let an area rest so that those birds don't get pushed out. And if you've been able to do that, I think folks have had a pretty darn good season.
Yeah, I think, people don't, like you mentioned, sometimes it's overlooked a little bit. Taking some of that pressure off the birds will really keep them around. And one area, and I know we have another migration editor that covers Texas. Have you heard anything out of Texas? I've got a couple little updates if you haven't heard much.
I have not. I'm curious to hear what's going on down there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like from some of the guys that I know, and this is far, south along the coast, even that prairie area down there, that it sounds like they picked up a bunch of birds. I saw videos of some guys posting where it's like, I've never seen this many birds down here. Obviously, the coastal areas, have good numbers of redheads down there. I'm waiting to talk to Kevin Cry with, Texas Parks Wildlife Department. Usually have him on here. He provides a pretty good update. I know going into the season, they were pretty dry throughout, but then over the last month, they've gotten some pretty good precipitation, and I'll have to kind of nail Kevin down on that because I don't have a great idea. I don't want to say anything that would be out of bounds here, but I know the coastal guys have done pretty well throughout the season. The guys who are hunting some of those ag fields, down there have done very well. But Kevin always emphasizes that kind of Oakwood Bottoms area that throughout, kind of north and a little bit kind of east of Dallas, where, if they get water in there, they have, pretty good water no matter what. But if they get water in there, it seems like the numbers really pick up. So I'm sure some guys are having some, really good hunting there. I'll get with Kevin on that probably within the next couple days. We should have another alert on that. So, John, before we get you out of here, I just wanted to know, how was your season overall? You kind of wrapped it up already.
Yeah, for me personally, it was not a great season, not going to lie. Just where I lived and where the birds were largely concentrated, it was a little bit of a hoof for me to get there and do the scouting, but I did have a number of pretty good hunts, and really I ended my season on a really good note. Just kind of caught that right after Veterans Day. We had a system move through. And I honestly thought it was kind of going to be the bell ringing on the season. I thought we were done after that point, and then the birds still hung out into December. But ended on a good note. I was able to team up with a good friend of mine up northeast corner of the state, and just had a couple of really just fantastic hunts for mallards and some honkers and some snow geese. Overall, there's never a bad season. Just being able to get out there, and especially like toward the end of the season there, kind of on the razor's edge of the migration, and just watching birds kind of pile through the state. There's just an electricity in the air. There's an energy in the air that it's hard to understand unless you see it. But being able to be a part of that, to witness that, big push of birds into the state was pretty darn cool. Overall, in terms of numbers, not my greatest season ever. But it's I'm at that point in my career as a hunter where it's not always about the numbers anymore. It's just about, in all honesty, and I know that's cliche, but it really is, just being able to get out there. If I can get my dog a couple of retrieves, that's a pretty good day for me. And then I've got a son, my son Miles. He's going to be starting duck hunting next year, and he, that's going to become my focus now, to get him on some birds. And so we've got some plans in the work to get him out next fall and to get him down to some other places out of state. So I'm pretty excited about that. But overall, not a bad year. And from the hunters that I talked to here in South Dakota, I think if they were in the right places, they had actually a pretty good year. And so hopefully this moisture that we're getting today, I'm looking out my window and I can hardly see across the street. Hopefully that is going to translate into some better habitat conditions here on the prairie this spring. And, we'll have some good local production this summer. So it's all one big circle, Chris. It's all works together.
That's right. Now I was going to say, you're already optimistic about the next season. So that's a true waterfowl hunter right there, John.
That's right. I try.
But the most important question for South Dakota, how was your pheasant season?
Kind of the same thing. There were places that were really, really good. Bird numbers we haven't seen since probably peak of CRP, which is 2007 or so, 2008. And so bird numbers were very good. The area that I tend to hunt, where I have some pretty good access to private ground, was really dry though. They had an emergency hang on their CRP acres, and so landowners are eligible to take off half of that grass for haying and for grazing. And so habitat was down in that area where I hunt. It seemed like bird numbers were maybe down as well, just because of how dry it was there throughout the season. But I'll tell you what, I had some great hunts. My youngest son went on his first pheasant hunt with me this year and was a trooper, trucked through the grass and the snow and held up his first pheasant at the end of the day. And so again, as a hunter, my priorities are changing a little bit in terms of why I do it and why I love to get out there. And so seeing my boys be able to come with me and play a role in it means a lot. And I'm excited to get, for next year. My youngest just asked me the other day, when we get to go pheasant hunting again. But as I look outside at 3 feet of snow, I'm not sure it's going to be anytime soon.
Awesome, John. This has been a great little update and appreciate it. And I'm sure all of our listeners kind of stay tuned over the course of the next, 25 days. You still got some more migration alerts coming out. I think as we kind of dip down into more of the southern portions of the Central Flyway. I know we've got several alerts lined up for that. We'll probably do some more habitat updates like this. But it's been great, John. I appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
I'd like to thank my guest, John Pollmann, for coming on the show and providing a little Central Flyway habitat update and hunting. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.